Love has its limits. And when it comes to spy circles, this probably includes honey traps. You know the stratagem used by intelligence services, where spies exploit romance to gather secrets. Now it's evolving with modern times. Reports say Russian spies are using dating apps. They're targeting German politicians and soldiers. They're trying to get intelligence related to the war in Ukraine. And we'll talk about it tonight. But this strategy is not unique to them. And it's not new. Spies across countries and centuries have employed this method. In fact, honey trapping has existed for longer than you may think, probably longer than most Valentine's Day traditions. And history has some of the finest examples. Here's a report.
Love them or hate them, dating apps have become the reality of modern love. Most of us are mining them for romance, but some are doing it to topple governments and gain inside information on wars. People are spying with a swipe, and government officials are stuck in honey traps. We're talking about Russian spies. They're using dating apps like Tinder, swiping left and right, forming connections online, reportedly doing so to gain intelligence, mainly on the war in Ukraine. According to reports, their targets are German politicians and members of Bundeswehr, that's the German armed forces. Russian spies are trying to recruit them as sources of information. Why is this? Because Germany has been one of Ukraine's allies. Thousands of Ukrainian troops have been trained in the country. So for Russian spies, Germany is the obvious arena. And the German Federal Office has reports. Tinder is one of the most used platforms for this. But spies are also using social media to forge connections. And Russian spy levels are rising in the country. Germany now has as many of them as it did during the Cold War. And Russia is no stranger to openly using data from dating apps. It already uses Tinder to collect the data of its own citizens. Dating apps have also forged a connection with the war in Ukraine. Tinder users can pay for a feature, which allows them to talk to people in different countries. Some people are using it to speak to users in Russia, asking them about the war in Ukraine. So honey trapping and war share quite the love story. And it's been going on for decades now. Here are some examples. Mata Hari from World War I. She was a Dutch exotic dancer, convicted of spying on Germans. Later, she was tried and executed. Or look at the Cold War. The Soviet Union had a clandestine academy. It trained young Russian women in the art of honey traps. But don't misunderstand, both men and women are adept at setting a trap. After the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, male East German spies honey-trapped officials from the western parts. Honey trapping is a tool of choice in modern warfare too. Only now it's done on online dating apps. Last year, an Indian man was arrested for helping a Pakistani spy. They were in an online relationship, and he had no idea about her identity. During the same year, Australia issued a statement. Foreign spies were reportedly using Tinder to obtain sensitive intelligence. In 2020, the US said foreign intelligence services may use data from dating apps. And China is not far behind. Its honey trap is so vast, Britain's MI5 has a 14-page document of safety protocol against it. When it comes to honey traps, there are far too many stories, too many dramas, and many ruined lives. No amount of training, integrity, patriotism, and cleverness has acted as a defense against them. The victims refuse to believe the reality, even when presented with evidence. That's exactly why honey traps have a legacy of being successful. Remember, in this battlefield of love, your next match could be a spy. So if it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Our lead story tonight is more bizarre than a Hollywood plot. The US has been infiltrated. Do you know by whom? The Chinese police. I know it sounds impossible, but it has happened. A major Chinese operation has been busted in New York. Beijing has set up secret police stations in the city of New York. These stations were used to threaten and hunt critics, also harass Chinese dissidents.
The NPS has repeatedly and flagrantly violated our nation's sovereignty, including by opening and operating a police station in the middle of New York City.
As dramatic as this is, it's not a first. America is not the first victim of such an operation. China has been setting up police stations around the world. This is a growing threat, a threat that the world needs to prepare for. So what are these Chinese police stations? And how do they operate on overseas soil? In which countries have they sprung up? We'll cover all of this tonight, starting with what we know about the Chinese operation in New York. It was discovered in Manhattan's Chinatown. This is a neighborhood in New York. America's main domestic security agency, the FBI, was investigating this outpost. Reports say the police station was set up in February 2022. It was operating in disguise. China says these outposts are basically service centers and they provide basic services to Chinese expats. You know, simple things like renewing a driving license. But in reality, these outposts operate like a police station. Two people were running the Chinese police station in New York. Their names are Liu Jiangwang and Chen Jingping. Both live in New York. Both are believed to be Chinese agents. American authorities have arrested them. They face two charges: conspiring to act as agent of the Chinese government and obstruction of justice. These are the two charges against them. The second charge, obstruction of justice, proves the Chinese link. Apparently, both men have made an admission. They've confessed to deleting evidence. And what kind of evidence was this? This was secret correspondence. It was exchanged between the Chinese spies and their handler. Now, who was their handler? An official from China's Ministry of Public Security. That's the principal police authority in China. And this handler was giving directions to Chinese spies in New York, and those directions, those communications have now been deleted. That's because they found out that they were under investigation. They got some indications last year, so they tried to clean up their act. They deleted the communications, and by the end of 2022, they also closed the police station. But US authorities were hot on their heels. They managed to nab the Chinese spies. They also searched the police station and found some crucial evidence. Turns out these spies were involved in all kinds of illegal activities, from harassing Chinese dissidents to threatening Chinese fugitives and forcing them to return to China. They did all of it. In one of the cases, these spies were enlisted to locate a pro-democracy activist. So clearly, this was a spying operation, and now it has been busted.
The secret police station appears to have had a more sinister use. On at least one occasion, an official with the Chinese National Police directed one of the defendants, a U.S. citizen who worked at the secret police station, to help locate a pro-democracy activist of Chinese descent living in California. In other words, the Chinese National Police appear to have been using the station to track a U.S. resident on U.S. soil.
So that's the story of the Chinese police station in New York. But like I said, this is not limited to New York. Such stations are everywhere. Do you know how many? More than 100, according to reports. China has over 100 police stations operating illegally in 53 countries, and they all serve the same purpose. They're on the hunt for Chinese dissidents. Can you imagine the scale of this operation? China is running a police station in practically every corner of the world and getting away with it.
It is a long overdue law enforcement action to push back against China's transnational repression that have been taking place in the homeland here in the United States and as well as in Europe. The law enforcement, policymakers, governments in various capitals have been somewhat reluctant to take action on issues like this.
I have some data from April 2021 to July 2022, more than 230 Chinese nationals returned to China. They were charged in criminal cases and they returned home. China said these nationals have returned voluntarily, but experts believe the secret police stations played a role here. They allegedly forced these Chinese nationals to return home. What about India? Do such stations, Chinese police stations, exist in India? Thankfully, India is not on the list. So far, there is no evidence to suggest that China has a police station operational in India. But this is a growing threat, and the world is acknowledging it. As of December last year, 13 countries had begun a probe into such centers. It's a start, but it's not going to be enough, because these are all individual efforts. What we need is a united response, because this is an unprecedented challenge. China wants to police its nationals beyond its borders. And this has huge national security implications for other countries. China is violating the sovereignty of nations again. The evidence is mounting. What we need now is for world leaders to act. Speaking of America and its problematic allies, Turkey got some good news on Monday. The US has cleared an F-16 upgrade package for them. The deal is worth around $259 million. As you would expect, the State Department is sticking to the routine script. Turkey is a long-standing NATO ally, and the package will increase interoperability. All true, but that's not the full story. The US and Turkey have been playing an interesting game. On the one hand, it's no secret that Joe Biden does not like Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In 2020, in fact, he called Erdogan an autocrat, even suggested helping the Turkish opposition parties. His predecessor, Donald Trump, had better relations. And yet, in late 2020, he slapped CAATSA sanctions on Turkey. CAATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. Here's how it works. Suppose you buy weapons from America's enemy countries, say Russia or Iran or North Korea. You buy weapons from them. Then the US government is empowered to impose sanctions on you. That's what Trump did with Turkey. In 2017, Erdogan signed a deal to buy S-400 missiles from Russia. 2 years later, the sanctions from America came. It was America's way of keeping Erdogan in check. But the war in Ukraine changed the equation. Suddenly, the US needed Turkey for two things. One, to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, and two, to approve NATO's Nordic expansion. Without Erdogan's green light, Finland and Sweden could not join NATO. And that meant advantage Erdogan. Last month, he did approve Finland's entry, but Sweden is still waiting in line. So reports say this F-16 package is supposed to be a positive signal, sort of like a nudge. But the question is, will Erdogan be satisfied with this? Because he has set his eyes on a much larger package. In 2021, the Turkish president proposed a $20 billion deal. Turkey would buy new F-16 jets and 80 modernization kits. That deal has been stalled by the US Congress. Why? Because they want assurances from Erdogan first. One is obviously the NATO expansion. The second is normalizing tensions with Greece. And third is not invading Syria. You may remember Erdogan issuing threats of invading Syria last year. It came to nothing in the end. If Erdogan gives these assurances, he may get the swanky new F-16s, but ultimately it's a question of how much leverage he has. Next month is election time in Turkey. Erdogan has already accused the West of trying to meddle. In fact, he's asked voters to, quote-unquote, teach the United States a lesson. Despite this rhetoric and the CAATSA sanctions, America seems powerless. It's a classic example of a bad marriage. On the one hand, the West gives Erdogan weapons and financial aid. On the other, he's slapped with sanctions. So election results in May won't just be consequential for Turkey. They could also reshape the country's relationship with NATO and the US. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.